In the summer of 1897, a ship docked in Seattle carrying a literal ton of Yukon gold, and within weeks, 100,000 people had quit their jobs, sold their houses, and pointed themselves at the Arctic. The Canadian government said, "Fine, but you cannot cross the border unless you're carrying a full year's worth of supplies." That's roughly 2,000 pounds of food and equipment per person, over a mountain, in the middle of winter. 70,000 people looked at that mountain and went home. The city that ended up with most of the money? It wasn't Dawson City. It wasn't anywhere near the gold. This is Money Origins, where we follow gold, wealth, and the systems that move them through history. I'm going deep on the Klondike today, because of all the gold rushes I've covered, this one has the most brutal math. By the end of this, you'll understand why the Klondike Gold Rush is probably the most extreme mass migration in economic history, and why the people who got rich were almost never the ones doing the digging. There's a pattern here that shows up every single time gold gets discovered. Stay with it, because the end of this story lands in a place most people don't expect. Worth saying up front, everything here is based on documented historical record. This is history, not financial advice. The Chilkoot Pass doesn't look like much on a map. It's a gap in the Coast Mountains on the Alaska-Canada border, about 1,000 vertical feet of exposed rock and ice near the top. The problem was the Canadian Northwest Mounted Police standing at the summit. Their rule was simple and non-negotiable. No one crosses without a year's supply of food. The reasoning was sound. People were already dying of starvation in the wilderness, and Canada didn't want a humanitarian crisis on its hands. So every man who wanted to reach the goldfields had to haul roughly 2,000 pounds of gear over that pass. Most of them did it in relay, carrying 50-pound loads up and back, sometimes 30 or 40 trips. In temperatures that routinely hit 40 below zero, through blizzards, in the dark, because in winter you only had a few hours of daylight. Photographs from 1898 show a single-file line of men stretching up the snowfield as far as the camera could see. They called it the Golden Staircase. It took most men 3 months just to move their supplies to the top. 30,000 people made it over. 70,000 didn't. Here's what those 30,000 found when they finally reached Dawson City in the spring of 1898. A boom town of 40,000 people and almost no unclaimed ground. The original discovery had been made in August 1896, nearly 2 years earlier. The prospectors who were already in the Yukon staked every viable creek within weeks of the find. By the time the men who crossed the Chilkoot arrived, the richest ground had been worked for over a year. Some of the best claims had already been sold. Of the roughly 30,000 who reached Dawson, estimates suggest around 4,000 found gold in meaningful quantities. A few hundred made real money. A few dozen became genuinely wealthy. The rest worked for wages in other men's mines, ran out of money, and eventually made the miserable journey back out, over the same mountain or down the Yukon River to the coast. The gold rush effectively ended by 1899. Industrial dredging operations bought up the claims, and individual prospectors couldn't compete with machines. The era of the lone man with a pan was over almost as fast as it started. So who actually got rich from the Klondike? Think back to that ship that docked in Seattle in 1897, the one that started everything. Seattle became the primary outfitting point for every man heading north. That ton of required supplies cost roughly $500 in Seattle. In 1897, the average American worker earned around $400 a year. 100,000 people passed through, and most of them spent everything they had before they ever saw the Yukon. Hardware stores, shipping companies, outfitters, hotels. Seattle's economy roughly doubled in 2 years. The city used that capital to build infrastructure that made it the dominant port city of the Pacific Northwest for the next century. The prospectors carried the weight. Seattle kept the money. That pattern, the people selling shovels outperforming the people digging with them, shows up in the California Rush, the Australian Rush, every major strike I've covered on this channel. The Klondike just makes it more visible than most because the math is so stark and the suffering was so extreme. A quick note to close. This video reflects the historical record as it stands. If you're interested in gold as part of any investment strategy today, that's a separate conversation worth doing your own research on. If this kind of economic history is what you're here for, subscribe. I go deep on exactly this every week, and there's more on the channel that picks up where this one leaves off. A like helps more people find it, and I genuinely appreciate it.